So yeah, interesting story out of Tennessee. The legislature there is considering separating themselves from the federal government when it comes to education. They're considering cutting off the flow of federal funds and in exchange, restoring their sovereignty over the public school system there and ending federal mandates. Fascinating. Obviously, conservatives were pretty pleased, and quite a few liberals were very whiny. They think that it's totally fine, apparently, that children can't read or do math, but they know lots about gender and sexual orientation. So this bill that was filed this week would create this panel, 11 members, and would make recommendations. I mean, it wouldn't have decision-making power, but it would make recommendations to the governor and to the state's leadership on how the public school system could wean itself off of federal dollars. And that would allow the state to basically do things the way it wants to when it comes to education. Obviously, like every other state, Tennessee gets some federal money each year for education. But of course, like with every other state, it comes with strings attached. They say, here, have some free money. And then, oh, by the way, you have to do this, that, and the other. Including testing, including, I mean, every kind of mandate you can imagine, gender stuff, even the gender of textbook writers is covered in these things. So that money that sounds free actually comes with these terrible, terrible strings or chains attached. For most states, the federal funding for their education system is about 10% of their budget. Tennessee gets about $2 billion a year, and I think their education budget is about $10 billion a year. So a little bit more for Tennessee than for other states. But this committee is in charge, this panel, task force, whatever you want to call it, would be in charge of figuring out how to cut that off and replace that with funds raised at the state level. So the committee would be run by 6 legislators, 2 school superintendents, 2 teachers, and unfortunately, it would be chaired by a lady who we've met before at the Newman Report, Education Commissioner Penny Schvinn. She's the totalitarian who thought the government needed to go to every single child in the state during COVID and check on them at home because, I mean, you can't trust children to be with their parents, right? The government needs to oversee its children, right? That's the kind of mindset that some of these people have. It's very troubling. The panel would be appointed by Governor Bill Lee, who's from what I understand, something of a rhino, but maybe less so than certain others, and then also House Speaker Sexton. And in addition to figuring out the feasibility of whether they could do this, they'd also be in charge of actually drawing up a plan for doing it, a concrete roadmap. And the House Speaker, Sexton, says basically we'll be able to educate the kids how Tennessee sees fit without what he described as federal government interference in the schools. He said, and I'm quoting here from him, he said, "We as a state can lead the nation once again in telling the federal government that they can keep their money and we'll just do things the Tennessee way." And that should start first and foremost with the Department of Education. Kudos, Speaker Sexton. That could be a model for other states as well. Now, spokesman for the governor and for Senate leadership also indicated that they were open to these ideas. Senator Randy McNally, who also runs the Senate and serves as lieutenant governor, blasted what he described as overly burdensome mandates from the federal government, especially on education. And his spokesman said he thought these discussions on ending federal funding and restoring Tennessee control over the schools were constructive, is the term he used. But as I mentioned at the start, a lot of whiny liberals who are happy with the status quo were whining because that's what they do. So you've got this guy, Senate Minority Leader Raumesh Akbari. He purports to represent a district in Memphis where basically everybody's illiterate. I mean, if you look at the government's data, it is an absolute atrocity. I mean, no possible person in their right mind could think this was acceptable. But he says, and I'm quoting here from him, this funding, this federal funding, lifts up underserved students in rural schools and ensure that every kid gets warm meals during the school year. He says, no matter how many studies they do, there will never be a scenario where it's a good idea to reject billions worth of federal funding for our students and teachers. Fortunately, that kind of lunacy is in the minority in Tennessee. These people don't have a whole lot of power at the state level. In Memphis, they do. That's why one of the reasons why the kids can't read. That's one of the reasons why it's one of the most violent cities in the entire United States. It's one of the reasons why the poverty rate is out of control because they follow these kinds of dumb policies. But yeah, they want to keep this whole school fraud going. They want to keep the federal funds flowing, and they want to keep Joe Biden's boot on the schools of the state of Tennessee. Now, there are multiple plans being developed right now to get states out from under federal control. A U.S. PI, U.S. Parents Involved in Education, where Duke and I both serve on the advisory board, has been working on a plan for a while. They've got a plan for the federal government to stop it. Now they're working on plans for states to stop it. But it very much looks like, from what we've seen, that you could cut the federal funding, and actually you would save money because you wouldn't have to obey this dizzying array of endless mandates. Now, obviously, there's no legitimate reason for the federal government to be extracting money from all Americans to unconstitutionally pay for schools in Tennessee or any other state. Of course, the 10th Amendment makes that the responsibility of states and or the people. I would say the people. And so there's no reason for the states to be submitting to this. It's absolutely preposterous. Getting the federal government out of the public schools will be a really good start, in my opinion, on the road to eventually going further and getting government out of education, putting parents, churches, and local organizations back in charge of schooling. And who knows, maybe Tennessee can lead the way.